context of the ancient world, um, a way to not just bring people together in terms of creating gains for a small elite, but it also brings people together in ways that can benefit the community as a whole in, very practical ways. Remember, this is a period before money. So, wealth is measured in labor in that can be commanded or coerced or brought to bear on a situation. It is the goods that you can give back to the community or the temple. And we can go out and do the large scale irrigation work that is often tied to temples as institutions in ancient Mesopotamia. Um, it can be brought to bear on bringing people together to form an army if you need to defend the city. Um, and this is done through ritual, which often includes feasting. If you think back to the last lecture where I talked about, the slightly whimsical but actually kind of compelling argument that maybe it was beer that brought about large scale that brought about agriculture because alcohol was part of um, you know feasts and ceremonies of commemoration and funerals in the ancient Near East. Um, this is an important way of bringing people together. Think about all the friends that you have had dinner with. Think about God help me, fraternity and sorority parties that involve feasting and other shared rituals. And on the other side, this kind of community is also built through shared taboos, um, through things that you are not allowed to do, through the fear of missing out. Think about the last party you may have gone to where, like, you don't really maybe want to go at, the beginning of the evening, but like, oh, all my friends are going, and like, I don't want to miss out. This is social pressure. Social pressure is a kind of taboo. Um, Not wanting to miss out, not wanting to be thought of as different, not wanting to transgress the boundaries set out in by the community in one way or another. So, other ways that these early cities really came together um, also involved the large scale organization of agriculture. So we've been, the last couple of lectures, I was going on and on about the development of agriculture. Well, this is where that pays off. So we modern scholars can investigate um, large scale agriculture in ancient Mesopotamia in multiple ways. We can do that through archaeology, especially through kinds of remote sensing, such as satellite investigation, through ground penetrating radar, and other ground based forms of non invasive archaeological survey, but also through the written sources, especially when we get a little bit later. We're right on the cusp of the development of writing in this period with the earliest cities in Mesopotamia. But what we see when we get a little bit later, and there is writing, not just seals. Um, the surviving sources, which are clay tablets, mostly focus on the large institutions, the temples and palaces, the households of the upper elite in Mesopotamia. And we're not entirely sure if what we can learn about these massive institutions, which seem to have controlled large amounts of land and therefore large amounts of agriculture, and its surplus products, whether this is representative of most agriculture in Mesopotamia or if this is just, what we have the written records about. So we always need to keep that little bit of doubt in mind. Um, looking across these sources, which include things like accounting records. The Temple of Inanna gave this measure of grain to this temple dependent to farm this amount of land in this area outside the city, um, and we expect X return on that. That kind of account, that kind of product-based accounting. Um, we can we can see a really sophisticated and intensive agricultural system. We have fragments of a Mesopotamian agricultural manual. Um, and, from all of these sources, we can, scholars have put together a picture of a system of intensive irrigation and a really useful and well thought out knowledge of land management. Um, whole systems of crop rotation. So this year we grow this kind of crop. This year we grow this kind of crop. So we grow wheat first, and then we grow beans, and then we grow this as ways of it not just maintaining but also building soil fertility. We see we see programs of fallowing, what's called fallowing. This is when, if you let a field go fallow, that is not cultivating it for a year. And often you would, in the ancient Near East, because of the issues with the various water tables, so what is the aquifer, the sweet water? Remember, we've got that temple of Enki, the god of sweet water, versus the saltwater table, which, could be very close to the surface. This is a very, very flat land, and very close to sea level. Um, the allowing fields to go uncultivated every other year or every third year. Those fields would often be used for pasture. Um, Sheep and cows poop, manure that enriches the fields, that year off, can then be followed with, growing large scale bean crops to fix nitrogen. They didn't think about it in terms of, the technical fixing nitrogen in the soil. But, they had a immense store of practical experience. They also invented fascinating devices, things like this. This is called a cedar plow, not not cedar like the tree, but cedar as in it had this funnel device on it. So the plow pulled by oxen that digs, a furrow into the soil, and walking alongside. So you've got one person. These plow teams were usually 3 people. Walking alongside the oxen, keeping them going in a straight line and moving. You've got, one person handling the plow itself and physically pushing down on it to dig it into the soil at the right depth. This would have all taken a great deal of strength, physical strength. You have the second person on the team, and then the third person on the team is there with the bag of seeds feeding them into this funnel type device that drops the seeds directly into the furrows. This is faster and more accurate and more economical of seed use than the other common method, which is called broadcast seeding. You may have seen this in, I don't know, paintings of the early American West. Some person with a big bag of seed walking behind the plow and just throwing it out in handfuls. That's literally broadcasting. Throw wide. That's literally what broadcast means. And we did, in fact, take that terminology, that agricultural terminology, and turn it to radio and then television. um, where, both radio and originally TV before the invention of cable, yes, I remember those days. Yes, I am old. Which just, broadcasts, sends out in all directions from a tower antenna um, to your devices. Um, and we have in these written sources, we have um, sources that attest to 20-to-1 yields for grain. So if you were, you know, allotted a bushel of grain as seed by the temple um, to plant on X piece of land and tend for the temple that owned the land. You might perhaps at the end of the season harvest 20 bushels of grain and take most of them back to the temple itself. So this is agricultural surplus. Those yields that are hopefully larger than what you planted, not always, because agriculture is even today a even today agriculture is fundamentally a profession for gamblers. There are so many things you can't control. But if you know a lot, if you're very experienced, you can you know turn the odds in your favor more often than not. Um, Low agricultural history. How do we turn the odds in our favor more often than not? This agricultural surplus is essentially used for tax, for trade, for storage, and for redistribution by institutions. So that agricultural surplus of grain or you know other products. Barley was the most common grain grown in ancient Mesopotamia, with some wheat kind of on the side. Today we grow, in terms of like grain for humans to eat, we grow mostly wheat, and barley and other grains are kind of, far less um, prominent in our agriculture here, at least in the US. Um, in the southern part of Mesopotamia, especially, dates were an important crop. Sugar is a Southeast Asian plant, ultimately, and did not reach this part of the world until after the Islamic conquest, until at least until the Islamic period. So dates, that sticky sweet fruit of the date palm tree, were the major source of sweet food. Date sugar, and dates themselves are, an important crop in the South that then could be, used for trade or surplus or redistribution. The people of southern Mesopotamia grew flax, like I mentioned with the Samara culture, and also sesame seeds for um, especially for oil, but also for eating as the seeds themselves. And then there was also smaller scale, quite a bit of smaller scale horticulture, growing all sorts of other kinds of vegetables, um, especially those legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and many other kinds of, vegetable crops. Um, but grain was the key. Grain was the ultimate staple food here, especially because grain is storage friendly, far more so than vegetables, than dates, than root crops of many sorts. Grain can be dried and stored for years at a time. And that was, kind of the start in this part of the world, the start of, the accumulation of wealth by these institutions. So, there were, so once you start talking about agriculture, you also need to talk about like who owns the land, and how is the land controlled. There were, again, I'm having to, because Mesopotamia is a very long time with a whole lot of, individual um, places. It's, please be aware that I am generalizing like crazy here. Um, it seems that um, with this, early foundation of temples in the cities of southern Mesopotamia. And I mentioned earlier this idea that of the city as the estate of a deity. Um, Temples seem to, especially early on, have had control over large areas of land and large amounts of labor, both um, the labor of free people, in what can be called a corvée system, whereby you um, do public labor as essentially a form of taxes, but also enslaved. Um, we see enslaved people in ancient Mesopotamia, largely as prisoners of war, but also people who were simply born enslaved, from those circumstances. Um, and alas, I don't have time to get into this. This is an entire realm of study in the ancient world. Um, so, if the temple is ideally the house of the deity, households in ancient Mesopotamia and in many other pre-modern cultures weren't just family units the way we think of them. They were ultimately economic units. And we still maintain some vestiges of that. Think about the sort of political idealization of the small family business or the small family farm in the U.S. Um, so, households as units of economic production were very important in the ancient Near East. And this goes to the highest levels. Temples, as the household of a deity, were an economic unit. And so, if the temple had control over a very large area of land and, was able to call upon, even, you know, even in some cases if it did not ultimately own, but could call upon large amounts of labor, these, are ways that temples functioned as economic units. The way they gather agricultural surplus, they'd use it for festivals, they might in fact trade it. Temples had merchants in their employ, turning some of that agricultural surplus, of which southern Mesopotamia had a lot through, its very intensive and very sophisticated farming practices, into things that were very rare, naturally in Mesopotamia. Things like gold, things like incense, which mostly comes from the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. Precious stones, stone itself. There is some limestone in southern Mesopotamia and a few other kinds of stone that occur naturally, but mostly this is an area of immense alluvial silt, essentially mud, river mud. They've got, good land, and they trade for the other things, but, fine stones, and, large amounts of extremely durable stone for statues and building. That bitumen that I talked about earlier, that could be found on or near the surface in northern Mesopotamia. All of these things are things that temples and also one of the other major institutions, the households of rulers or palaces. These are sometimes called temple economies and palace economies. The households of rulers and other members of the wealthy elite, things that they, traded for, or at least that they contracted with merchants to sell their surplus and bring back to them. So I'll talk a bit more about kingship in a little while in this lecture and also a bit in lecture 5. But it seems that, or at least the kind of the standard view, is that originally, in the very first moments of these cities, the church and state, the temple and the secular leadership of the city, were, if not the same thing, at least very, very closely tied together. Eventually, over the course of the first, few centuries, again, this is a thing that happens differently in different cities in Mesopotamia. Over the course of the sort of initial periods of the life of these cities, we see a little bit of more separation between temples and what we might call secular rulers. Put big quote marks around secular rulers. There is, since there is very little separation, but they did become sort of two, hopefully, complementary institutions with, the rulers, the quote unquote secular rulers of a city, being in charge of things like military defense. But also, again, like the temples, owning large amounts of land, being in charge of, extremely, significant amounts of agriculture and animal husbandry. Very early on in Mesopotamia, we get this idea of the ruler as shepherd. And this is something that, still comes down to us today. If you think in terms of Christianity, the idea of Christ as the good shepherd comes out of these kinds of, Mesopotamian, ancient Near Eastern ideas about the core importance of caring for flocks. And we'll in a bit I'll talk about the idea of sheep, goats, but especially sheep as part of just the foundation of wealth in the Mesopotamian economy. So wool production was a huge part of both palace and temple economies, but especially associated with the women of the elite as both artisans in and of themselves, although there were many artisans not directly tied to the temples and palaces, as we start to see more and more craft specialization in the urban areas of southern Mesopotamia. But royal women themselves were sort of stereotypically in charge of wool production, and especially managing large household staffs that included many artisans in the many steps of wool production, and then weaving, and then selling those textiles not just within a given city, but also outside of the region, again, as part of that long distance trade. So rulers and the wealthy elite also controlled large amounts of land. And finally, ordinary people. In the surviving textual sources, we see many accounts of ordinary people renting agricultural land from institutions, and that could be, a generational thing. It is not that uncommon, both in the far past, but also in the quite recent past, for rents to be for leases to be generational things, not just year to year. So we see ordinary people renting agricultural land from institutions like rulers and temples. But after about 2000 BC, we also see a wider privatized land ownership. Ordinary people who would have done, much of the farming either at the, under the direct direction of institutions like temples or palaces, or, on their own land or on rented land. They, many of them actually lived in the cities. If your fields were close to, the cities themselves, many people would just literally walk to work and farm, farm an area just outside the cities themselves. We also have, these cities in ancient Mesopotamia would also often have a network of smaller settlements around them that were tied to them very closely. And so that village life that I talked about in the last couple of lectures um, never went away. We are adding layers of urbanism on top of, you know, the village structures that we've talked about already. Um, so over here on the left is just a generalized sketch of what one scholar has called an agricultural cell. So like a basic kind of system, a basic kind of unit of production for agriculture of multiple different kinds, because these different kinds of agriculture work together in southern Mesopotamia. So we've got a section here between point A and point B. That's what's drawn up here. That shows, here's the river. Here are levees that can be pierced for irrigation. Here's the aquifer, the sweet water underground, and how this all interacts with wells. And then you can at certain times of the year you can pierce those levees as needed, bring that water down into orchards and gardens close to the river, which can then also be watered as needed with wells down into the aquifer, into the grain fields on these well-drained levee soils, and then less productive basin soils, marginal fields that might be used for grazing, and then the leftover water ultimately getting into the marshes that surround these areas. And then this system also includes different kinds of other kinds of production. On the levees around the major irrigation canals, you'd find timber and other tree-based crops, date palms, fruit trees, vegetables. In the villages themselves, people would keep pigs and ducks. Chickens had not made it out of Southeast Asia at this point, but ducks and geese had been domesticated. Pigs were widely eaten in early Mesopotamia, and pigs are excellent at making use of all sorts of essentially leftover food. If a human can eat it, a pig can probably eat it. We're both omnivores. So these, and then a bit further outside the village, off of these, outside of the sort of zone of orchards and gardens that can be, that need closer attention and hand watering, we have the field systems. And these were kept under usually every other year systems of fallowing. So in the winter, every other, you would grow cereals, and then you'd let a field be fallow for a year. And then you'd grow legumes, and then it would be fallow for a year. And then you'd grow linseed, or you'd grow linen or your flax, and it would be fallow for a year. And then you would start this long cycle over. And then in the fallow years, you bring in sheep and goats who could graze either out in the desert above the marshes, when there was fodder browse available in that area, or after harvests, and when the desert was too dry, you bring them in to graze on the fallow areas and fertilize with their manure. So this is, you grow reeds and you have fish populations in the marshes. It's a very integrated, complex, ultimately very productive system of agriculture, and is the basis upon which the wealth of these Mesopotamian cities was ultimately built. So, if agriculture and especially grain production was one of those sort of roots of the wealth of Mesopotamian cities. One of the other extremely important sources of wealth was sheep. Um, and the temple and palace controlled flocks of sheep and goats that could number into the tens or hundreds of thousands of animals. Um, so as one of the previous slides mentioned, but which I didn't get into too many details about, many agricultural jobs were specialized. Um, those cedar plow teams were, specialized. You needed special skills to do that and do it well. Similarly, um, shepherd, herding was a specialized profession, and goats and especially sheep were raised by teams of shepherds for dairy products, um, butter, cheese, milk, um, for meat, of course, for hides, but especially for wool, and that's especially true of the sheep. Um, there were several varieties of sheep recognized in Mesopotamia, um, some of which were called Sumerian sheep, which were the original sheep breed of southern Mesopotamia, and also what were called mountain sheep, or what are still recognized today as called fat-tail sheep. Sheep who store fat in their tails, much the same way that camels store fat in their humps. Um, and these sheep were both prized for that fatty tail. Most sheep today have their tails removed when they're very young. Um, and also recognized for producing finer wool, better, nicer, finer, um, more abundant wool than the sheep that were originally bred in southern Mesopotamia. So before I talk a bit more about wool production, this is a traditional sheep breed, the Washera sheep, um, today found in Ethiopia. There's a big anthropological project called Evo Sheep, um, based out of the University of Oxford, that is recording a variety of small traditional breeds of sheep in the Near East and North Africa, um, both for historical research and but also because many of these sort of small niche breeds preserve interesting genetic qualities that may improve sheep breeds in the future. Um, so this is one of these very traditional ancient Near Eastern, broadly Near Eastern sheep breeds found in Ethiopia. This is a small statue of a sheep laying down, a recumbent sheep, um, from roughly this period we're looking at, the early part of Mesopotamian city-states. Um, and the sheep are very common in the art of this time and place, because they were so important in the economies. I also, frankly, am showing you guys this because it's just a kind of an adorable little sculpture of a sheep. Um, and finally, we have one of these accounting records. Um, from slightly later, I'll talk about the invention of writing here in a bit. But this is a very early form of cuneiform, and it's an administrative account of sheep and lambs owned by different shepherds that's now at Emory University. So shepherds, as specialized teams. Sheep would be then usually brought to the cities, where they would be plucked. Sheep were still sheep today have largely lost the ability to shed their hair on their own, and therefore the wool has to be shorn. It has to be You have to give a sheep a haircut at least once a year for most breeds of sheep today. Not all of them. Some still lose their hair. But in this period, with early urbanism in the ancient Near East, sheep were still um, able to be plucked. So if you have a long-haired dog, many of them will do what's called blowing their coat, and where they lose most of their undercoat, the finer, insulating undercoat, a couple times a year. Sheep would do that. Once or twice a year, they would lose that equivalent, like, woolly undercoat, and it could then just be like plucked off the sheep without having to like cut it. This was done often in the cities, often by palace or temple, dedicated palace or temple wool production staff. Then the wool would be kept at the temple or the palace, processed, cleaned, sorted, just like many other kinds of creatures. Sheep grow a variety of lengths and textures of wool in different parts of their bodies. You can blend it all together for sort of a mediocre, medium-ish length and fine, length and density of wool, or you can sort it. Especially if you have large flocks, you can sort it and use, put together all of the very nice wool from like the necks and um, um, other parts of necks and front legs and other parts of the sheep, all the nice wool together across your whole flock, and use that all for, say very nice clothing or very things where you want very fine wool. And then, the coarser stuff from like their hind ends and their upper backs, that can be used for rugs or something like that. So you'd sort the wool by, how nice it is, how fine it is, how long it is, how thick it is. It would be cleaned, it would be combed, and then spun into yarn of various thicknesses, dyed, and finally, after 90% of the work is in the processing, and finally the last like 20 to 10% woven in the cities by sometimes by you know specialist producers who were artisans outside of the temple or palace system, or by employees or enslaved people who were intimately connected to the palaces or temples. Um, so this and large scale grain production, barley especially, were traded widely, both across the region between individual cities, but also well outside of Mesopotamia for, like I said, things that could not be produced in that area itself: gold, spices, bitumen, different kinds of stone. And as several scholars have argued, um, really quite recently, um, these flocks constituted wealth on the hoof. And they could be put to a variety of uses in the political communities that emerged in Mesopotamia during the fourth and third millennia, and that these are especially useful for the kind of low power states, which I will explain what that is in a bit. That they could take on lots of roles as sort of complicated forms of, social, political, economic, and cultural capital that could be used as statements of power, and also, literally to finance in the most basic sort of way, state projects and claims of power in a world where, the whole idea of the state was just sort of being built. Again, I will talk about this more. So, these are just some examples of this early southern Mesopotamian urban culture, the Ubaid culture, it's often called. And you'll probably see quite a few similarities. It's got, dark designs on light in terms of pottery. It's got, these open bowl form, these open plate type forms that we've seen before. Late in the Ubaid period, we start to see more sort of abstract floral decorations, and we see this pottery spread widely, not just within southern Mesopotamia, but also outside of southern Mesopotamia, which seems to speak to both the interconnectedness of cultures in this period and also the spread of the idea of urbanism itself and centralized institutions itself. And so can be a proxy for how widely not just the economic reach, how wide the economic reach of the Ubaid culture and the cities of southern Mesopotamia were in this very early urban moment, but also how that culture influenced the other ones around it. Another sort of key proxy, an artifact that lets us see the reach and influence of the Ubaid culture are these, frankly, kind of weird looking, what are little figurines. They're sometimes called Ophidian figurines. That's a fancy way of saying lizard-like. Sometimes they are just called lizard people figurines. Scholars argue about whether these weird faces are masks, or if they are cranial modification, which I'll talk a bit more about in a bit. These are that we find Ophidian figurines that are both anatomically male and anatomically female, male, female. They are found first, so around 4,500 when we start to see them. They're first found only in domestic contexts, so houses. But later, archaeologists also start to see them in graves. They are nude, and they're extremely stylized. That means when an art historian says something is stylized, it means that it fits a a sort of quasi-standardized, non-naturalistic way of portraying something. Let's see. Art Nouveau, 19th century mostly commercial art style, Art Nouveau. Probably have all seen it before, is very stylized. There is a sort of standardized style for depicting things in Art Nouveau. Similarly, there is a very specific style of non-naturalistic features that we see on these lizard people figurines. These proportions, they are very long and very skinny with very broad shoulders. Unnaturally long and skinny and unnaturally broad in the shoulders. Like, this is some like peak 80s strong shoulder going on here. Like several of the cultures we looked at earlier in the lecture, they've got these eyes that seem to be based on the shape of cowrie shells. Cowrie shells are found in the Red Sea and in the Persian Gulf, and widely traded throughout the Mesopotamia and the Levant throughout the Neolithic period. And most strikingly, these figurines have this weird elongated head shape. This could be a mask. This could, however, be cranial modification, or it could be both, frankly. Modification. Cranial modification is when the shape of a human skull, because we are all born with the plates in our skulls not fused together, because of the realities of human anatomy and our detrimentally tiny birth canal, in comparison to most of the rest of the animal kingdom. Newborn babies' heads are soft. If a newborn's skull is let's say bound with strips of fabric, or bound to a hard surface in particular ways, it will, and it's done consistently for the first 6 months or so of life, as these plates in the skull fuse together. In the early months of human life, you can reshape the skull. This doesn't seem to cause any real modification of, brain capacity. Your brain just adapts to the, non-round shape of, the brain case. And we see this as early as 9000 BC with some of the plastered skulls in Jericho. This guy was kind of squared off. Seems to have been kind of squared off early in life. And we see this throughout both the ancient and modern, up into, really quite recent times in some places, and around the world. So this guy is from Jericho from about 9000 BC. This very, beautiful young lady is one of the daughters of, or is identified. It's a sculpture of one of the daughters of one of the kings of Egypt, Akhenaten, from around 1400 BC, in the middle of the Bronze Age. Continuing clockwise, we have this photograph from 1970. This is a portrait done by an American anthropologist of a woman named Mabombio, who's the principal wife of Chief Mogendo of the Mangbetu people of northwest Congo, the modern Democratic Republic of Congo, around 1970, and she's also had cranial modification. It seems that this is, very often done for aesthetics. People just think that this is an elegant shape for a human skull. It also can be done for spiritual reasons, to connect people to, the spiritual world in some sort of way. We also see this outside of Afro-Eurasia. These two, in the lower row here, these two skulls are from different parts of the Americas. This one is an Olmec, skull of an Olmec person from the Central American Gulf Coast, probably sometime between 1200 and 400 BC. This is from the American Southwest, the Sonoran Desert in Mexico around 1000 AD. And then this gentleman here in this 19th century photograph is from Toulouse, France. And this is one of the last places in Europe where cranial modification seems to have happened on a regular basis. Although in 19th century France, it was more inadvertent and had to do with a local practice of immobilizing a newborn's head to try and prevent head injuries in very young children, which then, if done a little too enthusiastically, would commonly result in, a cranial modification. Again, this doesn't seem to have impacted people's mental capacities in any way, and it's something that we see widely throughout history. Um, um, the Sumerian cultures, starting in the Ubaid period, the Sumerian culture of southern Mesopotamia spread throughout north and mid Mesopotamia, not consistently, but in places, starting around 5600 BC, and also to the south, throughout the Arabian coast, especially on the Arabian coast of the Persian Gulf. The area around the island of Bahrain that the Sumerians themselves called Dilmun. This is tracked via those pottery styles that I showed you 2 slides ago, and other things like the Ophidian figurines. This is one of many periods of where people in northern and central Mesopotamia seem to have adopted features of the culture of southern Mesopotamia. Now, this isn't consistent. This isn't done in the same way in every area, but we're going to look at one specific instance at this place in Upper Mesopotamia called Tepe Gawara. So Tepe Gawara. This is a view of the tell itself. We're in part of Upper Mesopotamia, where the preferred modern term is tepe instead of tell. This is the tell itself is not intact. Excavations in the 1930s removed about 7 meters just straight off the top, and also then dug further in specific areas. This tell has also, like many archaeological sites, been under extensive pressure from looting, in this case by ISIS during the Syrian civil war, and who tunneled extensively into the tell itself. The illegal antiquities trade was one of the major funders of ISIS in the late aughts and 20 teens. And in fact, modern scholars are actually quite concerned that parts of this tell could collapse. Furthermore, planting of large olive groves in the plain around the tell itself are also threatening the archaeological materials that are buried in the what's called the lower city, the areas that were inhabited that are not part of the mound of the tell. Tepe Gawara was excavated first in the late 1920s through 1930s by the University of Pennsylvania, who found 16 phases of occupation on the tell itself. Very recently, in 2021, a project started that first combined analysis of satellite data the 50 years at this point, almost 50 years of satellite data available of the satellite imaging of the area with sort of sporadic surface survey to see what is visible on the ground, followed in 2022 by a systematic survey of the area around the tell itself. And that is, 2022. Surveyors, archaeologists found evidence of about 24 hectares. So that's about 50 to 60 acres of habitation in the off of the tell in what they call the lower town in the late third millennium BC, and this is what's currently being threatened by large-scale modern agriculture. So industrial olive groves. And this is ongoing research, so I'm giving you the breaking news about Tepe Guara. Most of what we're going to look at in the next couple slides is based on the excavations in the 1920s and 30s, however. So, Tepe Guara, level 13, which is dated to roughly 4000 BC, saw the building of this really large complex, not all of which survives. The stuff that's filled in crosshatch here on the north and east sides of this dotted line. This is the edge of the tell. This is conjecture based because this part of the tell must have been lost to erosion. However, archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania did excavate the rest of this complex, which has these three very large buildings that look strikingly like the buildings of southern Mesopotamia. So we've got Temple A, like the temples we saw of Enki and Eridu, oriented with its corners facing the cardinal directions, with this sort of double T-shaped plan. And if you remember, I said I'd get back to these buttresses. These buttresses, which not only help keep the walls up, but also in the very strong light of the sort of open areas of Mesopotamia, also have an aesthetic feature. Also, they make these like strong vertical lines running of light and shadow up the sides of the building. And this is, we can think of this as sort of a visual signature of southern Mesopotamian architecture. This is part of what's sometimes called the Uruk expansion. So this is a little later than the Ubaid period. And I will talk about the Uruk expansion more in the next lecture. But these large temples are built partially over earlier temples that were not necessarily built in this style. This temple, the northern temple, Temple A, measures 12.25 meters by 8.65 meters. So this is quite a large building. B is even, ultimately even bigger. And these were all in use at the same time, and it is not clear if especially B and C were temples or possibly some kind of administrative building. So it seems that, at least briefly, at Tepe Guara, someone was, using both the visual language of southern Mesopotamian architecture and probably the administrative techniques to build build power at this site. However, the really important influence of Lower Mesopotamia does not exclude local developments or local choices or traditions or trajectories in both material culture and also as we can see here, and as I will talk about a couple other examples in the next lecture, um, probably in government as well. So, a little more architectural comparison. This is a plan of the seventh temple of Enki at Eridu, and you can see the buttresses, the need to turn 90 degrees, the altar at one end, the offering table at the other, the large central room of this tripartite plan with the two smaller banks of rooms to either side, and you can see the similarities, the buttresses inside and outside the mud brick walls. This is probably the entry area. The doors marked out with those buttresses, and then entering into this long central hallway, and not quite, banks of rooms, but these like niches that are kind of doing the same thing as this tripartite plan. So these are roughly contemporary. This is the 13th level at Tepe Gwarra. This is Temple 7 at Eridu. And then, so this is level 13. This is phase 11. So sitting essentially two phases, sitting, with a phase in between, phase 12 in between, this completely different building that was built on top of that we're going to call it an administrative complex, temple/administrative complex, on top of the tel at Tepe Gwarra. Now this is a really different building. And we've seen at Eridu how similar, even as they grew in size and, built over and around and on top of each other, how similar each phase of these temples in Mesopotamia could be. Tepe Gwarra, they've done something completely different, radically different. Now this is not just, oh, I think we're going to build something round here instead of, something that looks like it came from southern Mesopotamia. No. Phase 12 at Tepe Gwarra, the temple looked very much like Temple 13 here. Phase 12, however, sees a violent destruction of the site. Areas burned, excavators found dead bodies under collapsed buildings in the streets, and parts of the city, just like abandoned, leveled off, packed down. We're not going to recover the bodies. We're not going to do. We're changing everything here. So violence, destruction, and then in phase 11, this deliberate change to this round fortress building that may be like a deliberate denial of the visual culture of the Uruk expansion. This is, completely different, and it is essentially fortified. This is a very thick wall. It had another building on top of it, and, even if this is an entrance, which it is not necessarily clear, even though this has been reconstructed as a gap, it is not entirely clear that this was an entrance. Even if this is an entrance, anyone who comes in here with ill intent is, in a labyrinth, with all sorts of blind corners and places for ambush. This seems to be a fortress. This seems very suited for defense. In this phase, in phase 11 at Tepe Gwarra, we also see the signs of this community cultivating its own regional network of trade. Phase 11 is where we find the oldest evidence of gold use in the ancient Near East, and most gold supplies actually come from Anatolia at this point. So trade to the north, um, rather than to the south. So, local choice, local agency is always a factor in how things develop, um, not just in the ancient world, but today. Um, I'm going to talk a bit more about, the spread of institutions and hierarchy and centralized authority in the next lecture. But it's not just architecture that is spreading at this point, and that communities throughout the ancient Near East are, seem to be experimenting with in a variety of ways, based on what's going on in these newly urbanized areas of southern Mesopotamia. Um, for example, one of the most common things that is found in the fourth millennium throughout these Sumerian influenced parts of Mesopotamia are what's called a beveled rim bowl. They are, so if you remember, you know, charmingly painted Halaf and Hasuna and Samara culture ceramics that we looked at, earlier in the lecture, this is like strikingly crude. Nobody spent time on these bowls. These are largely standardized. They're essentially uniform in size. Most of them are about 10 centimeters tall. The mouth of the bowl is about 7 inches in diameter. So 10 centimeters, which is about 4 inches tall, 18 centimeters, which is roughly 7 inches in diameter. Straight, steep sides that might be just sort of roughly smoothed off, but certainly not decorated in any way, down to a very, straight lines down to a very defined base that's usually about 9 centimeters or 3.5 inches, give or take, in diameter. And these were made in the thousands at many sites from southern Mesopotamia all the way up to the border, up to the hills at the southern end of Anatolia. And these are generally thought to be some sort of ration bowl, for standardized rations of grain or bread or other, staple foods, um, given out by institutions in return for labor. Um, these are by far the most common find in this period of archaeology, and these are, seem to be very, clear evidence of the spread of institutions and centralized authorities that first seem to have first developed in the early cities of Mesopotamia, like Eridu and Uruk and Ur. So this is usually identified as the beginnings of state formation. So we're going to leave the world of particulars and specific archaeological sites, and pick up with that again in lecture 5. I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture um, talking about sort of the theory of state formation and theories of states, and sort of stages of social and political evolution. So this kind of large-scale abstract thinking about government is a thing that goes back, very far indeed. We could, God help me, we could start with Plato and the Republic and the philosophers of classical Greece, but let's not. Let's leave that for other classes from the classics department and the philosophy department. Instead, we're gonna think about how anthropologists have thought about this over the last 50 years or so. Um, quite a few anthropologists, especially starting in the 1960s, have, tried to come up with, generalized theories of how states begin. One of the most influential is from the early 1960s, published by this guy, Elman Service, um, who wrote this book, Primitive Social Organization: An Evolutionary Perspective. So this is part, if you look at that, evolutionary, this is part of that, push to make archaeology and anthropology more scientific that happened, post World War II. And Elman Service's basic theory is that, social and political evolution moves, along predictable lines as populations grow, and especially affiliated populations. So starting, and with his terminology, the smallest scale society, which is the band, an egalitarian, group of 30 to, 100, maybe 100 individuals, with family ties to each other and to other bands. Once you have several bands of people in a general area meeting, and interacting with each other, intermarrying, from bands we get in Services scheme, from bands we get tribes, and these are, multiple bands linked together through family ties and productive capacity. And there's often with the idea that there's a certain amount of mutually beneficial trade that will happen, within the tribe. Maybe, this band has the western area of a sort of larger territory and they have better berries over there. And so when the whole tribe gets together a couple times a year, the Western Berry Band brings their extra berries and trades with, I don't know, with the Eastern Band that has, I don't know, better root producing plants in its area. That kind of interaction. From tribes, as they grow in population and grow in complexity, Elman theorized that we get chiefdoms. These are, several tribes linked together, living more closely together, with an elite stratum of society that manages the, social and economic and ideological aspects of the community, where you get, chiefs, with their supporters, just on the rank below them, where you might get a more specialized religious personnel dealing with the ideological part of the community, and where you start to see a ranked hierarchy of individuals within the wider chiefdom and within, the individual communities. Chiefdoms can, then, compete with each other in a variety of ways, both sort of inside and within. There would be then competition among the elites inside a chiefdom and between chiefdoms themselves. So he's, kind of in his theoretical setup, this is the beginnings of, warfare, the beginnings of military society, and also a thing that he calls chiefly cycling, wherein, like, one family might gain power and hold the chiefdom for a generation or two, but then they are, knocked off the top of the hill by, another rising elite family, and it'll continue to cycle. From chiefdoms, through series of chiefly cyclings, eventually, eventually states develop, that hold territory, in a more formal way than a chiefdom, that sanctions and shapes and controls the use of force, states that have civil institutions and laws that are the bedrock of society rather than kinship. And this is where we start to see also the solidification of social status into classes, essentially. So this is a quick overview of, this relatively early theory of state formation. Um, so, theoretical structures are, of course, refined over time. Um, this is the Elman service schema, band to tribe to chiefdom to state. In the 90s to early 2000s, we start to get some refinements of those ideas. Hunter-gatherers, at about the same level as bands. Village societies to ranked societies, and then what some scholars call a pristine state, the first states that develop out of earlier societies, like the first cities of Mesopotamia, like the um, early dynastic, the early dynasties of Egypt. Um, and then, after those pristine states fall apart, we get secondary states. And we are entirely in a world of secondary states and later at this point. So, this would be secondary states, would be things like the Akkadian Empire, or in Mesopotamia, after the city states of Sumer, of southern Mesopotamia, which I've just been talking about, um, are eventually conquered by Sargon of Akkad. I will talk more about that in coming days. Don't worry if you don't know who I'm talking about. Or after the dissolution of the dynasties of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, and there is a what's called an intermediate period before Egypt is reunified around the first dynasties of what's called the Middle Kingdom. This is all very abstract. And then, more recently, we've had scholars who are really trying to, you know, think about, well, this doesn't move in a straight line. Bands or hunters and gatherers, societies go through periods of stability, but they also go through periods of, rapid change and discord and competition and strife and warfare. And so more recent scholars have tried to incorporate that in our sort of abstract, theoretical understanding of how states form out of earlier forms of society. And this is this model that thinks about, like, okay, we've got bands of hunters and gatherers, and then maybe we start to see some social hierarchy forming, some haves, some have-nots, and then maybe that is how we get to tribes. And even though they're egalitarian politically autonomous village societies, I'm not going to explain everything here. This is just a bunch of notes. Again, we start to have hierarchy emerging, some steeper divides of wealth in a society, and that again can lead to strife and discord and people killing each other. And to work, and in working that out, we start to get again another more formalized systems of dealing with each other in chieftains, in ranked societies. Then we get the chieftain fighting chieftain, and chiefly cycling, so small scale warfare and political machinations and assassinations. And then that chiefly cycling is, again, needing to come up with systems of dealing with that leads us to these early states, pristine states or archaic states or empires. And then, those, once again, states don't last forever. There's a coup, there's a rebellion, and that's what the need to build stability after that. is what leads to these secondary states or more politically savvy empires. This is a useful model in that it encourages us to think about states as works in progress. They're always incomplete. They're always, presumptive, cobbled together efforts to, bring about specific kinds of authority that don't necessarily exist before. A state is an idea that has to be created and seems to have been created over a very long period of time. And this is again a thing I will talk about more in the next lecture. Essentially, already talked about this. How do we get not people who are not related to each other to cooperate? I talked about like feasting, rituals, taboos. As Stanish said, a series of culturally specific rewards and punishments to keep a group together under the leadership of the people that a community accepts. So the question then is like, how do we see these in the archaeology of the first state? We've looked at some of these to a certain degree. Population nucleation, the people coming together, the density of population. We've talked about that in the last lecture. We've talked about it in this lecture. Eridu, on a smaller scale, the late Neolithic settlements we looked at. Monumental construction, bringing people together through labor, and building these recognizable visual symbols of, what a community is. We are the people who live within this wall, and we built that wall, and, that shared experience brings us together. And, the having an elite, part of being an elite in this period is the ability to marshal labor. I've already talked about this term corvée labor. This is like, in brief, it's like labor instead of taxes. So in Egypt, we see this with building the pyramids. The Nile River floods. The land cannot be worked for, multiple weeks or even a couple of months at a time. So it's the perfect time to work on, that pyramid. So, instead of paying your taxes in grain, you go off and you work on the pharaoh's, monumental tomb for the months that you can't farm. Craft specialization. Once again, this is a thing we can see archaeologically, and a thing that we see often at the beginning of urbanism and at the beginning of things that we can call states. Forms of administration and record keeping, not necessarily writing. I'll talk more about the development of writing later, but it's hard to figure out who has done their service for the year if you're not in some way keeping track. Very often, we also see a switch from matrilineal to patrilineal descent, and we're not entirely sure why. I'll talk a bit about the possible exception of the different states on Minoan Crete, but very often we see a change from the would seem to be matrilineal and matrilocal. So living in a maternal line or with one's mother, and one's mother's kin rather than with one's father's kin. We often see a switch from maternal focused to paternal focused ways of reckoning kinship. Territorial expansion, long distance trade, also definitely seen earlier, but in different and more intensive ways. And systems of surplus and debt. So these are some of the things we can see, but this is also not a uniform process, and it doesn't happen in the same way in every region, much less in every city. So one of these big divisions in early states are the a type of state called city-state versus what's called a territorial state. Um, Now, the for the ancient world and for the sort of first developments of urbanism and state institutions, these break pretty cleanly between Mesopotamia as as city states, at least early on, versus Egypt as the sort of model territorial state. Um, I'm gonna let you guys read through this. We'll talk more about this in the next lecture. City states are, often broadly similar, with intense rivalry and competition between them, around densely occupied urban centers, whereas territorial states will control, as the name implies, far larger areas of territory. Um, that territorial unification can often happen before the development of any other characteristics of complex states, and this is part of what makes Egypt um, unusual in the sort of broader ancient Mediterranean. Um, so instead of a focus on the city, we often see a focus on a royal court, which may or may not be permanently located in one particular place. It may move around between royal estates or a handful of cities. Um, we also often see cities that are smaller or less densely populated than in city-states. And I will address that when I talk more about Egypt. Um, so, um, these are, yeah, pristine states in Mesopotamia. Um, the With many, many different states in the millennia that follow. I'll talk a bit about the Akkadian Empire, um, but there is a long history of successive empires and periods of city-state organization that happened throughout the history of Mesopotamia that we don't have time to go into in depth in this particular class. But I will talk a bit about the Uruk expansion um, with its seemingly colonial spread up the Euphrates River and what seems to be an early system of surplus and tribute. Um, and then famously Egypt, we have essentially um, regional chiefdoms that in contention with each other very early on. In the middle to late 4th millennium BC, so the 3300 to 3100 BC, um, the first unification of Egypt seems to come out of this competition between chiefs living and clans that live along the Nile Delta and the Nile River Valley. And then one of these first kings, there's some debate as to whether Narmer, this guy, um, was actually the first king to unify Egypt, but let's say he's the first whose name we know and who had, good and widespread press. We see the victory of this kind of canonical first king and his unification of Egypt celebrated in some of the most famous pieces of early Egyptian art, like this object which is called the Palette of Narmer. These are monumental two-sided reliefs that are in the shape essentially of a makeup palette. So you grind your coal for eyeshadow essentially in here in this well. Some of these palettes are don't even have this sort of vestigial grinding area in them. They are just makeup palette shaped. Um, but Narmer, we have written evidence in this very, very early form of hieroglyphic that suggests that he established his capital at the city of Memphis. And he and these first kings from the first dynasties of Old Egypt, of the Old Kingdom Egypt, you work out the symbolic language that we see used until the last independent ruler of an Egyptian kingdom, which is Cleopatra the Seventh, who was eventually destroyed by Rome, and Egypt was in 30 BC, absorbed by the Roman Empire. But we still see symbols begun at this very beginning of an Egyptian state in use at its very end, including these two crowns, the white crown of Upper Egypt, which is in the south, upstream in the Nile, and the red crown of Lower Egypt, which is the area of the delta in the north, near where it spreads out and eventually empties into the Mediterranean. These early states often, their power often exceeds their grasp. And so scholars very recently, in the last decade or so, have really started to rethink these, earliest states, and how much they could actually do, and really how the whole idea of a state as the set of institutions and the whole idea of people being governable at a level beyond what you can see and interact with on a daily basis, how that all developed, and these these are just a couple of quotations from people who are thinking about this. And we have to remember, as Grossman and Paulette write in 2020, that the things we call states are complicated amalgamations composed of differently positioned individuals and groups, acting according to their own interests and needs and strategies and perspectives. So these are often highly contingent, very these early states are often very delicate things, that very often fell apart, and much of the visual language of power that we see, and which ultimately becomes the written language of power, is not advertising an actuality, so much as it is building an ideal of what a state is, and the kind of power that states claimed, and that they reached for in these very early moments, are often far greater than what they could actually accomplish. But these are the origins, the bombastic, bragging origins of the powers that we all live under today. And I think this quote by Clifford Ando, who's at the University of Chicago, is a really good place to end this lecture. All state orders require continuous renewal and reconstitution. And he's talking about the ancient world, but I think this is, really something that applies across political institutions today as well as in the past. All state orders require continuous renewal and reconstitution. They are perpetually in statu nascendi, which is admittedly a slightly pretentious Latin phrase that means in a state of being born. States are always, a thing made And as important as the continuity of institutions are, we have to continually renew them and continually essentially believe in them. And that is a process that started, this early, um, thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and, which still continues today. All right. Thanks for listening. You'll hear me in the next episode when I talk more about some of these complementary ideas about cities and state formation in the ancient world.